Hi, I'm Steve Hassan, and I'm delighted to have with me for a repeat Chrissy Stroop, who's out in Portland. Hi, Chrissy. How are you?
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for having me back on.
A
I'm pretty good,
pleasure.
thanks. How are you?
And I've been wanting to do a thing to help promote the book that you helped edit called Empty the Pews for a while since it's come out. So thanks for doing this with me. I guess I want to say that you're a PhD, you're a Russian expert, you're a really good editor and writer.
It's very kind.
And yeah, so there's a bunch of topics I want to cover with you, but because you're in Portland and because Trump is sending troops or agents to stir up trouble, even though the mayor doesn't want it, the governor doesn't want it in Oregon. What's going on there that you want to comment about?
Yeah, well, these protests in Portland have been strong and sustained ever since the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests against the police murder of George Floyd began. And I live about mile and a half, 2 miles, somewhere in between there from the Willamette River. I'm on the east side of it. So just across the river basically is where everything is happening. And we don't get the tear gas here in this neighborhood, but there are people who live in downtown Portland who aren't even protesters, who are suffering ill effects from the tear gas that's being launched into the streets below their apartments every night. And yeah, the use of these federal agents without insignia, what were called in Crimea when Putin sent them in to annex Crimea, the little green men, Trump's little green men.
I'm glad you
It's
mentioned Putin because we're going to come back to Russia. Go
it's
on.
quite a disturbing tactic. So I have not yet been able to confirm whether anyone has actually been disappeared per se, but people have been grabbed off the street, shoved into these vans, taken to federal facilities and detained at least for hours and not given any kind of record of their arrest. So, whether anyone has been spirited away to a black site, they're using the same sort of tactics that could lead up to that sort of thing. It seems like right now they're intimidating people and letting them go, but they won't tell them who they represent. They won't tell them who they are. They won't give them an arrest record. So it's a real, thugocracy sort of tactic.
Yes. Yeah, and for those of us who study dictators and history, we're very worried, even if Trump is not reelected, that there'll be violence in the street potentially with some of his
Hmm.
true believers and some of the Alex
Sure.
Jones followers who with their automatic rifles and all of that. So
Yeah,
very
recently I
concerning.
published a piece about Idaho politics and their implications for the wider United States, because there are a whole lot of those sort of radical libertarian Christianists, and they don't see that as a contradiction. Out there in Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, mostly North Idaho, and parts of Montana. There's a whole conspiracy theory there that they consider this space to be the American redoubt, right? The last stand, the sort of little fortress of
Hmm.
the true American patriots, who don't believe in wearing masks and do believe in having automatic weapons. And
Yeah.
it's nuts what's going on. Some of those people could very well become violent. I've got contacts on the ground in North Idaho, and those people who are not officially working on behalf of the government are intimidating protesters. And in North Idaho, there are Black Lives Matter protesters who are very brave to go out there. And then, you have these huge white dudes with guns. Initially, they were going to places like downtown Coeur d'Alene or Sandpoint, Idaho, and
Hmm.
saying that they were protecting businesses, whether the businesses there wanted their protection or not, and
Hmm.
threatening people. And according to my contacts on the ground in Idaho, that didn't go very well. So then they decided that they were protecting the protesters, and they started following the protesters around everywhere they go with their giant guns. Uh, and yeah, there are also the same kind of people who are refusing to wear masks and are contributing to our terrible pandemic response.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's that, and then Trump, he uses these kind of weather balloons, trial balloons, right, to see if he can get away with things. And if we allow him to get away with just throwing people into vans, giving them no record of what actually happened to them, and detaining them for several hours, I mean, maybe then he can get away with really disappearing people, spiriting them off to black sites or some sort of camp.
Exactly.
And I think that the idea that they're aiming toward, and they're kind of going to go as far as I think we let them. That's
Yeah.
usually the dynamic of an authoritarian dictatorial regime.
Yeah.
Would probably be to be able to declare anyone they want to be an Antifa terrorist, right? This is the whole.
Or a
This is.
lefty, just a Democrat.
I mean,
The cult of
maybe
Soros,
maybe
whatever.
they'll go that far. Yeah, anybody that they don't like, they're creating these bugbears in their minds.
Right.
I did get a round trip ticket to New York, an overnight stay in a hotel, and a free lunch from George Soros once. Well, from the Open Society Foundations, they gave a
Oh,
talk there.
wow.
Did not meet George Soros himself, but he
Yeah,
certainly doesn't.
that's great. And he put $220 million, I think, towards promoting human rights and racial justice.
Oh
Um,
yeah, Soros is a good man, but I'm not on his payroll.
yeah, no, nor I. So Chrissy, there's so much I want to talk to you about, but let's start with why should people know about this movement, Evangelicals, which was our last blog and interview. Why is this important to our current political and spiritual and situation?
Mhm. Sure. Well, I think I'll start with a little bit of media criticism. So, major US media outlets have had a tendency to normalize extremism, if at least, it can be represented by some people with power and money. So, white evangelicals, they are largely an authoritarian demographic with cult-like social dynamics that are then projected onto a large social scale.
Yeah.
So, they're their institutions, their families, very much strict father, patriarchal, top-down morality prevails there, which allows abuse to fester and to proliferate. And we see them, of course, projecting that then out into, well, all these Democrats have a secret child trafficking ring, and Q is going to save us. I mean, a lot of evangelicals are going in for that stuff right now.
Mm.
It's a weird mix of, more secular-ish New World Order types and evangelicals who are in the whole QAnon thing, but that's a whole other story. But
Yeah.
anyway, who gets to speak for evangelicals in the national conversation? Who gets to define them? Who gets to frame the narrative about them? Well, mostly it's been wealthy evangelicals with powerful institutions behind them who are considered respectable by the media. And I mean, look at how the New York Times first reported on Hitler when he was rising to power back in the day, right? They said, well, many people say that he doesn't really mean what he says about the Jews. He's just cynically using this to get power. And they were very both sides about Hitler. Well, they
Right.
haven't changed all that much.
Yeah,
So
and
people
people
like,
forget that the Nazis had a big rally in Madison Square Garden and filled it,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
in that period. But
And
please continue. So media
yeah,
criticism
so
there.
it's people like Russell Moore, who is very good at putting a friendly face on evangelicalism, or Peter Weiner at the Atlantic, or Michael Gerson at Washington Post. All of these men have been to varying degrees critical of Donald Trump and evangelical Donald Trump support. But even before Trump, they dominated the conversation. And people who wanted to say, well, look, these groups use manipulative and controlling tactics on people. They cause extreme psychological harm. They do physical and sexual abuse, and they cover it up. It was very hard to get a hearing in the public sphere, and it still is.
Yeah.
But that's starting to change. We've made a few cracks in that edifice. You more often now see ex-evangelical voices being considered in media analysis. And so I was hoping that Empty the Pews would, help to continue to reshape this conversation and provide a counter voice to the respectable evangelicals who are very good at spin and PR.
Right.
That was always a part of it for me. I know that my co-editor Lauren O'Neill was simply more invested in the power of stories and the empathy that it can incite, and just entering into someone else's world and understanding something. And to me, those are kind of, two sides of the same coin in this particular project.
Hmm.
Stories, personal narratives is often how we change conversations when they need to change, when they've been dominated by, one sort of large majoritarian in-group, or at least group with the power. And people who are othered by that group don't get to have a voice.
Yep.
Stories help to change that. That's how we started to get a lot more progress on rights for various minority groups, and in recent years for the LGBTQ community.
Right. So I want to just insert, if I may, in my research for the Cult of Trump book, what I learned about, and this was from Frederick Clarkson and so many others who've been researching the right wing, talking about the family of Jeffrey Charlotte's family that Netflix has a series, Opus Dei, the Catholic right wing group, the New Apostolic Reformation churches where people claim to be apostles and get revelations and cast out demons, and their quest and the connection with the Manhattan Declaration of the Catholics and the Protestants to go against women's right to choose health care, gay rights, and wanting to impinge on their version of what religion is, to undercut the separation of church and state. So I just wanted to add that to the frame that you're painting, that there are, in fact, very wealthy, powerful groups directly linked to the White House that are trying to manipulate
Oh, absolutely.
and exert power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so a lot of these people have connections to the Council for National Policy, and the coming together of these groups. Well, the particular ins and outs of these networks has been tracked very well by Ann Nelson,
Yes,
among
Shadow
among
Network,
among
excellent
others.
book.
And But it is kind of amazing what a small world it is on the right when you kind of start digging into it. I recently did some research on a sort of self-styled new initiative called Public School Exit. I'm not sure it's anything much more than a website full of propaganda, but it calls on people to take their children out of public schools, which they call government schools or indoctrination centers, right? Because of this right-wing authoritarian projection that they're
Right.
doing. And so the people who put out the news release on it, that was covered by sites like WorldNet Daily, which is a radical fundamentalist conspiracy site. Turns out that one of them is a member of the Council for National Policy's Education Committee. His name is E. Roy Moore Jr., and he has, or Ray Moore, sorry, not the Alabama former Supreme Court
Uh,
justice. Anyway, he's a member of the Education Committee of the Council for National Policy. They put out that, sort of, I don't know if you would call it a white paper. I mean, it really wasn't formal enough to be a white paper. It was more sort of a plan, but I think you probably saw it back in, I believe it was 2017, where they were saying Betsy DeVos as education secretary will
I'm glad
be,
you mentioned her because we can't forget
yeah.
Amway and how she is put in
Mhm.
power over education when she doesn't believe in public education.
Right. And so the CMP was like, this is great. She can be our inside person there and help
Right.
us undermine and ultimately destroy the Federal Department of Education, which they don't think should exist. So that's one of these people. One of the other sponsors is a woman who is involved with a network of radical right-wing churches, and she's an anti-trans activist in California. And then the other sponsor is Alex Newman, who calls himself an award-winning journalist. And I don't know, maybe some far right-wing rag gave him an award once, but he writes for he's a John Birch Society member, and he writes for the Bircher publications. That's what he does,
And
right?
let's
So
remember that the Koch Sr. was one of the founders of John Birch, right?
yes, that's an important connection to make in this context. So
Yes.
this is someone. So Ray Moore, he runs something called I can't remember if it's the Exodus Initiative or the Exodus Mandate, something like that, though. But it's a thing he's been running for decades, which is dedicated to the same cause, undermining public schools by having Christian parents take their children out of them and put them into homeschooling or Christian schools where they can be closely controlled and indoctrinated. Of
It
course,
really indoctrinated,
save.
like
Indeed, I'm a Christian
against
school graduate.
science, and
I know what
again,
it's like.
yes.
Oh, speaking of that, would you be interested in hearing a science paper I wrote in 4th grade? It's about 3 paragraphs long.
Yes, if that's what you'd like to share, I think that will be well. And I just want to frame that you grew up in this authoritarian version of Christianity where, thinking for yourself was evil,
Mhm.
and being in your body and having sexual feelings or thoughts was evil. And
Right,
so
absolutely.
right? So the
And
bite model, my model, and the influence continuum actually fits what you
very
were
much, very
raised.
much, very much applies. I
Yeah.
think that kids who go to a lot of, Protestant Christian schools in the United States could probably be compared to the products of Soviet schools. I mean, it's very similar. You get up in the morning and you go into the classroom and everyone stands and says 3 pledges: Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States, of course, followed by the pledge to the Christian flag, followed by the pledge to the Bible. So
I didn't
it's
know
a
there
God
was
and
a
country.
Christian flag. Forgive my ignorance. What does that
No,
look like?
it's fine, and you can see it flying sometimes if you go to like a Hardee's in the South, the rural or small town South. I mean,
Really? I
yeah, some
need
of
an
these places
image
fly
of
fly
that
the
because you're
fly the
educating
Christian flag.
me. You're
I
educating me.
can definitely find you an image of the Christian flag. It's really it won't be hard to Google,
We'll
and
add it
it's used
to
in.
we'll add it to the block.
So the Christian flag, I'm going to put it in the chat window, is the Wikipedia page about it. It
Yep,
is
don't
used sometimes
bother
in more.
because we're recording this and nobody can see that but me.
Right. Sorry.
Okay.
um, so it is sometimes used in more mainline churches as well, and there's a slightly more benign, less explicitly anti-pluralist version of the pledge, but we said the more explicitly anti-pluralist version of the pledge that ends with, I think, if I remember correctly, with life and liberty for all who believe. You have to believe to get life and liberty.
Yeah,
um,
that links to
or liberty
dispensing
and
of
justice.
existence. That links with dispensing of existence of Lifton's brainwashing criteria that if you believe, then you have a
Hmm.
right to exist, and if you don't believe, you don't have a right to exist.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's really troubling. So you do that in a Christian school, right? And then in every classroom, somehow everything is brought back to God, even math. And just like in the Soviet Union, which is part of why I make the comparison, evangelical Christians can excel in math and physics and engineering because those things don't necessarily directly challenge a totalitarian or all-encompassing sort of authoritarian ideology, right? So the
Hmm.
Soviets did great on space exploration, modern engineering, not always, obviously in the execution, if you want to think of Chernobyl, but the designs were good, and it just wasn't upkept because of the failures of the Soviet system.
Mm.
Soviets produced great mathematicians. I know a lot of evangelical Christians who are lawyers, doctors, engineers, computer scientists, that sort of thing. I know one who got a PhD in math. Um, so you can do that, and it doesn't challenge your worldview in the same way that biology did. I mean, which also the Soviets fell foul of, right?
Yep.
Because um, modern genetics was seen as anti-Marxist. They wanted to go back to Lamarck and throw Darwin under the bus, and that screwed up Soviet agriculture, even well past the age of Lysenko, because it's
Mhm.
not like the textbooks were updated all the time.
Right.
Soviet agriculture was the Achilles heel of that society until its very end.
Yeah.
So yeah, these Christian schools are very much authoritarian institutions.
Yes.
And that's part of
So
why I wanted to write, get Empty the Pews out there so people will know.
yes,
And
it's
yeah,
critical.
you take Bible classes as well, and they teach you a very specific understanding of the Bible that basically is linked to right wing politics. You're taught that liberal is based. I mean, no one actually explicitly tells you liberal is an antonym for Christian, but you get that message, right? Because the liberals are the people who are out there killing these babies, and they're telling 5 and 6 and 7-year-old children this, that liberals are killing babies and we have to stop them,
Right.
right? So this extreme in-group, out-group consciousness. But yeah, just to give you an example of, what they have fourth graders write. First of all, I mean, this is relatively sophisticated, right? And I don't think that's just me. I'm just repeating what they told me to say. So there's that, but it's also just full of lies. So this paper is from December 3rd, 1991. I'll just date myself.
How old were you? Can I ask? Can I ask or not?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was 11.
Okay.
The paper has a good job written at the top. I've got a digitized copy in front of me. So fourth graders write about things like this in Christian schools. First of all, I want to talk about the law of entropy. It basically says anything organized tends to become disorganized after a while. Take your bedroom. You clean it up time after time, but eventually it will be messy again. If this law is true, how could so much order come out of chaos? I believe that God created the world on purpose in an orderly way. But now there is pollution and lots of crime. This proves the law of entropy. The Bible says that each animal will produce its own kind. You won't wake up one morning and find a salamander in your fishbowl. Evolution says that by chance a cosmic explosion formed what we call Earth. Our universe could not have started without a plan. Scientists are always making up new theories and covering up old ones. God and the Bible never change, and the Bible started near the beginning of time. Darwin wrote his theories in the late 1800s. Eventually, he disagreed with himself. If this is not enough, here are some verses to look up in the Bible. Isaiah 40, 12 through 22, Isaiah 55, 10, 1 Corinthians 15, 13. This is why I believe in creation.
So I just want to mention I'm Jewish, and I belong to a very progressive temple for the last 22 years. And one of the books that we studied was Who Wrote the Bible? And it's by Richard Friedman, I believe. And it talks about the Torah having 4 distinct voices, 4 distinct writers, and why there are 2 stories of creation, etc. And it just blows to heck the idea that the Bible is the inerrant truth of God, but the Christians don't even read the Hebrew. They don't think that Jesus was a Jew, and to think about what the words ascribed to Jesus was coming from a Jewish mindset. They have no clue. So it's very interesting.
I mean, I would say that more sophisticated Christians certainly. And sometimes not just sophisticated, but slick, right? Jews for Jesus. But, those who have more formal education and want to present themselves as respectable certainly know that Jesus was a Jew, and they don't try to argue that Jesus was some white Aryan person. Of course, there are Christians who argue that.
Right.
But not the kind of Christians that I grew up as. They would have said that Jesus was operating in the Jewish tradition, but then they would go on to take a very explicit supersessionist stance, right? And say, but Jesus completed the law, and now we have the gospel.
Right.
So Jews who are still living under the law are not accepting their own Messiah, right? That was the talking point.
Right. Can we switch our conversation, if you don't mind? You mentioned an anti-trans activist, and I'd like to get into. I know in Empty the Pews, there's several people's stories about homosexuality and sexuality, demand for purity. Can you share what you think people need to know about this?
Sure. Well, so the Empty the Pews essays, I think, if I recall correctly, 16 out of the 21 essays are by women. So that just that's not, it's not a deliberate choice that we made. You often find that in spaces where people come together who have left evangelicalism and other kinds of high control patriarchal religions, you find more women than men, because they are disproportionately harmed in these subcultures. And the same thing happens with queer people, right? So the leavers are going to be disproportionately female and disproportionately queer. So there's a lot of good queer narratives in Empty the Pews, which makes sense. We don't really talk much about transness. I mentioned it briefly in an aside in my essay because I'm writing about a time in the past before I even could realize for myself that I was trans. I just always felt different, and I didn't really identify with masculinity, and I kind of didn't get it. but I was attracted to girls, and so I always just thought, well, I just must be a weird straight guy, and the pieces couldn't all come together until later. Um, but yeah, I mean, so transgender people are in the spotlight lately, with J.K. Rowling spewing anti-trans talking points and really just doubling down on it. It's something she's been criticized about for a long time.
Yeah, I really want
And
I really want to hear what you think about her because I'm new to the conversation, honestly, being a straight white
mhm.
male, about what the controversy is and where we can possibly move things to a more constructive
Mhm.
interaction and dialogue, really.
Yeah, well, so Rowling uses more dog whistles to imply this than to say it. But the position of people like her, who are sometimes referred to as TERFs or trans exclusionary radical feminists, and it's an ideological position that dates back basically to the 1970s and second wave feminism. It really ties just gender to anatomy, right? So they harp on biological sex as if it's a clear binary, when scientifically, we know it's really not. Even not just in the sense of really obvious cases of being intersex, or what used to be called hermaphroditism.
Yep.
Um, but in much more subtle ways as well. There's all kinds of things going on. And so biological sex is also a spectrum. This is something that anti-trans people don't accept. And there are lots of arguments that we could really get into the weeds with about, gender essentialism and who's being the real gender essentialist here, the people who tie your gender to your specific anatomy, or the people who don't. But the anti-trans activists try to argue um, that trans people are being gender essentialists, and that that trans women are basically men who want to enter women's spaces and take over everything because that's what men do. And trans women, or trans men, excuse me, are basically women who just want access to male power and male structures. And we know from neuroscience, kinds of medical and biological studies, from psychological studies, that gender dysphoria is a very real condition, and that there's a whole lot more going on there, and that it's a very unfair characterization of what it's like to be a transgender person. So it kind of comes down to those things. Now, I think, the slicker and the more respectable ones like J.K. Rowling would tend to try to argue that, she sympathizes with trans people. She stands for she wants them to have rights. She's just concerned about the children. That's always a great talking point for people who want to control people, um, and well, it's kind of a sort of classic deflection, right? But the children is always the excuse for being bigoted.
Yeah,
What if
so
children see
yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
what if children see a black person marrying a white person? Or what if the children of that marriage have to suffer? Or what will we do if the children see two men walking down the street holding hands? Right? It's a kind of
But you
classic
don't think
deflection.
she's anti-gay and anti-trans, or do you?
Oh, I do. I think she's very anti-trans. I think she holds deep resentment against trans women in particular, for, in her view, limiting women's rights and encroaching on women's spaces, and
So
forcing people to change the language in a way that makes her uncomfortable.
so tell me, because I'm new to this, forgive my ignorance, but what of, because I've only read what was on her website like 2 weeks ago and the Harper's letter, and I want to get into
Mm-hmm.
cancel culture because I read your piece about cancel
Mm-hmm.
culture. I just would
Yeah.
really like to have a better understanding of what what people think of, yeah, the field. And I'm pro trans, pro gay, but I also have sympathies to detransitioners that I've interviewed who feel
Mm-hmm.
like, they made a mistake. Some of them felt like they were being pressured into um, believing that they were really gay, but they were pressured into believing that taking
Mm-hmm.
hormones was the right move. Some people had surgery, and now they're trying to pick up the pieces. And I'm looking, Chrissy, for how to get out of the extremes into
Hmm.
like the human rights, really listening and connecting and trying to find common ground if we can on the subject.
Well, gender can be fluid. Um,
I
and
agree.
so, you know, so people can experience their sense of who they are in terms of gender differently at different times in their lives.
Yep.
So this may be something that's going on with some of these detransitioners. um, I don't think there's any kind of serious social pressure to transition. Anecdotal cases can always happen, but systemically, I just really don't believe that's happening based on my own experience with
Hmm.
medicine and what I've read. So here's what my doctor does. And she's been treating trans patients for a long time. When anyone starts to transition, I mean, she really asks, like, why are you doing this? She asks probing questions to make sure that you really know what you're
Is
doing.
this a
And the vast majority
psychologist
of
or a medical doctor, Chrissy?
She's a medical doctor. She's a general practitioner who has treated many, many trans patients over the years.
Okay.
And of course, you do still have to be referred to a psychologist to get them to sign off on surgeries, even just relatively minor ones. So that's still something that is part of the process. But she can prescribe hormones to you, which will start you on what we call second puberty. You
Mm-hmm.
know, but so she wants to make sure that nobody's doing this on a whim, right? And people don't, because I think once you realize that what social and medical transition entails, nobody would take this on without being very serious about it, because it exposes you. I mean, for a long period during this kind of transitional space, or maybe forever, where you don't pass, so to say. There's a little bit, that language of passing is a little bit problematic. I mean, passing as a cisgender person, but you kind of look like something in between an androgynous. And I mean, some people really embrace an androgynous aesthetic. Personally, I do like an androgynous aesthetic. And
Mm.
while I am a trans woman, I tend somewhat more toward the sort of chapstick, femme, and even butch end of things, and that's a thing you can be, right? Not every trans woman is
Right?
someone who wants to wear 6-inch heels and bright red lipstick all the time. Um,
They must be very
so
painful to walk in 6-inch heels.
I would think so. I haven't honestly tried that high, but I mean, I kind of think of high heels as torture device.
No, I have a
At the
gay
time.
son and he loves high heels, 6-inch heels. He loves
Mhm,
them. But
mhm.
he's a gymnast, and I'm like, what would your coach think about your
Yeah.
ankles in
Well,
6-inch heels?
it'll give him really strong calves, I should think.
Anyway, back to you.
But,
Sorry for the diversion.
yeah, no, no, no. So the doctor, she will really talk to you in depth about this. She took a long time. This is not like a 5-minute meeting where, oh, you want hormones? Here you go. No, it's like, okay, do you understand what you're getting into? What's your motivation for this? Like, how long have you been thinking about it? And you don't have to have the pat answer of, oh, ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be a girl, which is good because not everyone has that experience, right? The experiences of dysphoria or of transness, which sometimes can occur without dysphoria, are very different among different people. And so I had a revelation kind of I mean, metaphorically, of course, at age 33, but it's just kind of a bunch of things came together after a lot of thinking and processing and trying to figure out my life, and a lot of things had been repressed because of my fundamentalist upbringing. Um,
Yes. Which is
so,
where I have my experience base, by the way, in
mhm,
folks who are raised in those types of homophobic, high control, especially if there's corporal punishment used.
mhm.
And
We
so,
got the wooden spoon in my house growing up. That was the
yeah,
worst, though. I mean, some people had a lot worse.
yeah.
But right, so the doctor says, okay, well, obviously you've done your homework. You're serious about this. I'm going to give you a prescription for hormones for a month. This is a low dose. It's not what we call a therapeutic dose, but you'll start to feel a little different. And in a month, we'll come back together and see if you want to continue this.
Hmm.
And then we'll give you a little bit of a higher dose. And well, also you have to have blood drawn first before you can get any dose of hormones at all. So that's a little step in between as well, because they check your levels of various things and make sure that you're healthy enough to start hormonal transition. So you come back and she asks you directly, and she says that she asks every patient this, okay, do you want to stop taking the pills? And in her entire experience of treating trans women over, I think, a couple decades, if I remember correctly, she only recalls one person ever saying, "Yeah, I want to stop." So she just makes sure to ask everyone that, so
So,
that they don't feel any kind of pressure to continue if they don't want to. But for my part, the hormones almost immediately just started making me feel much better and more comfortable in my own skin than
oh,
I had before.
mm-hmm,
And I didn't want to stop. And many people have that experience.
mm-hmm.
So when it comes to detransitioners,
So
I
can
don't
I,
doubt that
before
many
we
of
go on to
them,
detransitioners, Chrissy, can I just ask about the psychologist and how much time she thinks is important for people to talk with someone who's a mental health expert to, you know, work on gender dysphoria issues, or is it just signing off, you know,
well, we're talking about adults, and you have to have two psychologists sign off on a surgery. So you have to get two opinions, and no, I mean, it's sort of a full. They'll usually need to do at least one full session with you, but sometimes they'll demand more. And this is at this
a
point
full
you've
session
probably
is
been
what, an
on
hour?
hormones for a while.
Is a
Yeah,
session?
about. I mean, it would depend, maybe 30 minutes to an hour, depending. Um, but I mean,
Yes.
most trans people really don't even. I mean, most trans people really even kind of resent that step because
Why?
they most. I mean, because I think detransitioning is very rare, and this is seen as gatekeeping. But it's. I mean, honestly, if you compare the U.S. to the U.K., it's much easier here. In fact, the UK, speaking of J.K. Rowling, is it's not the general public sentiment, but they have a very loud, very active anti-trans community, and they have much stricter government policies, which I find horrifying. I mean, they want you to live as the gender you feel yourself to be for, I think it's a year, maybe even 2 years before you're allowed to get hormones. Now, people get around that. But imagine not being able to actually have the hormones in your body, not being able to start that process of puberty and developing the secondary sex characteristics of the sex you feel yourself to be, and having to just go outside, at least, according to the official rules, wearing clothing that identifies you as the opposite sex, but not having changed your body at all. It's very dangerous in a lot of places. It'll
Mm-hmm.
attract violence.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's quite inhumane to regulate things that strictly as they do in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
um, because you're subjecting an already vulnerable population to likely violence if you force them to go out dressed as their chosen gender when their bodies don't look like it at all, because their subcutaneous fat hasn't been redistributed. They haven't started growing facial hair if they're a trans man, or they haven't started growing breasts if they're a trans woman. People still look at and judge people like that in a lot of places, and in a lot of places that can get you beaten up on the street.
That's new information for me, so thank you for sharing that. I hadn't considered that or thought about it. And I definitely want to say that there's a difference between people who are adults who are transitioning versus young people who are saying if I
Mm-hmm.
don't get this, I'm going to kill myself, and kind of this heavy pressure of all or nothing stuff. And here in Boston,
Yeah, well, sometimes they do kill themselves, though. I mean, particularly if they're not allowed to socially transition.
hmm
Um, and I mean, when it comes to young people and concern about the kids, I think a lot of the concern from these trans exclusionary radical feminists and from right wingers who, oddly enough, they get together on this.
yeah,
I think it's insincere concern. I think they're just using these kids as props. But here's what the medical establishment actually does with children. They make sure they get lots of counseling. And they generally recommend that parents allow their kids to socially transition, to dress how they want, to go to school. It doesn't make that much of a difference when you're prepubescent kids, right? So, kids get to then be socialized as the gender that they feel themselves to be. Most then, never look back. They appreciate this, and so then it becomes to the question of puberty blockers. And again, this is something that's done with a lot of expert consultation and the parents, having control over the process.
Yeah, the parents have
Um,
to sign on,
and
sure.
so puberty blockers are fully reversible. Nothing is irreversible until had hormones in your body long enough to start changes. So you get to the point where kids are teenagers and they've been consistently trans this entire time, and then maybe you start them on some hormones, or maybe in their late teens you start to consider certain surgeries, and they have great advantages, over those of us who didn't have a chance to do this when we were younger, actually, because they will never have the issue of not fully looking like a woman or a man to other people. They just get to have one puberty. They get to have it at roughly the right time. The rest of us have to have two puberties.
Mm.
We kind of get stuck with some secondary sex characteristics of the sex that we don't feel ourselves to be. But nobody's like pressuring children into this. Certainly not the medical establishment.
Mm.
There's a whole lot of process, red tape, if you will, consultations, counseling, all kinds of stuff for parents and kids to go through before they will do anything irreversible. And almost the irreversible stuff, I don't really think it ever starts super young. It's going to start when you're a tween or a teen.
Hmm. So, can we move on to cancel culture, or because I'm
Sure, but
looking at the.
let me just say quickly about detransitioners. Everyone has the right to their own story, but I think that celebrating detransitioners, just the way that's like some publications celebrate supposedly ex-gay people, is definitely not something helpful right now.
So you had mentioned Exodus, and I immediately said, "Oh, the ones that
Oh
would
yeah,
try to do conversion therapy, who admitted
different
that it
exodus.
doesn't
Yeah.
work." And I've been
Hmm.
critical of it forever. Once I understood what they were trying to do to people, it's straight out of my manual of understanding
Hmm.
brainwashing and mind control. Just
And
as
trans
the
people are
culture.
subjected to conversion therapy as well. But yeah, Ray Moore's Exodus project, I forget the exact name of it, it's a different Exodus.
Yeah.
It's about getting kids out of public schools.
Right. No, I got that for sure.
Hmm.
But anyway, we have a different opinion on detransitioners, but and I'm not an expert. I've only talked to 12 now. One of the most powerful person that I met with transitioned at age 19 to be a woman, and had the hormones and the surgery and lived as a woman for 20 years and had therapy and realized that they weren't trans and wanted to share their story, and it was met by the same kind of intolerance as an ex-Scientologist who wants to say what's wrong with
Hmm.
Scientology, or an ex-Moonie, by the community. And for me, that's where I got like, wait a minute, you
I
know,
mean, that seems like a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't seem like a direct parallel to me. Now, I'm not saying that detransitioners should never be heard, but I don't really think that there's any kind of community or movement. Certainly not to the extent that trans people exist and need to be heard and need to have our rights realized. So I just think we need to be very, very careful how we do it, because everyone does have a right to their own experience and their own story. And human experience is a very complicated thing.
exactly.
Our experience of our gender can be fluid. That's all fine. We can go there. And I mean, I have read some detransitioner narratives where they say that they do want trans people to have full rights and everything, that transgender people absolutely do exist. It is a real medical condition and phenomenon. Okay, if they're on board with that, then I don't think we really have we don't have to be enemies, right? But some of them are perfectly happy to allow themselves to be used as props of the people who are beating us down with a cudgel.
Yeah, the people I spoke with were not like intolerant or saying that all people who are trans shouldn't be at all. But, a number of the people I interviewed were raised in homophobic, authoritarian families and cult groups, and they didn't know. It was more appropriate to think you're the other sex than that I'm a femme, gay male,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
and
Yeah, because they simply got this gender essentialism as part of their socialization, right?
exactly.
And so yeah, I mean, I have talked to people who have like considered whether or not they might be trans because they don't know what it feels like. Now, women in particular who grew up in these kind of environments because they never wanted to be like what to fit themselves into these very restrictive prescribed women's gender roles.
Right.
So I mean I know that people like this do exist, but I don't think anyone is challenging their rights to medically go backwards, or
Yeah, I'm for listening to points of view on all spectrums and trying to just stay centered as a mental health professional who's a human rights activist and wanting to be a good listener and wanting to not demonize. And I'm very hypersensitive to brainwashing, mind control, disinformation campaigns, or dissing people who disagree. Like
I mean, I agree that people shouldn't be demonized, and certainly people who are not trying to take someone else's rights away, shouldn't be destroyed for simply expressing things about their own experiences. It is very fraught. There's a lot of very real trauma in the trans community, and I mean, one thing that I've learned in recent years is that survivors communities are very fraught spaces because people's differing trauma responses get crosswise, and you start
very
having
important. Yes,
you
exactly. The
you
trauma.
start having these conflicting trauma responses that often results in some very ugly social dynamics.
Right.
And I don't know what to do about that. I'm very,
Good
to be honest.
therapy. Good
Well, yeah,
therapy is what needs to happen. And if people can't afford it, we need to find ways to get them the therapy.
very, very
That's
true.
that's my
Survivors
that's my
communities are
world.
certainly not a substitute for therapy. It's very
Yep.
validating to find other people who have had similar experiences to you, but it's just a step. It's a small part of the healing process, and you have to do a lot of
Right.
self work, which you'll do a lot faster. And maybe you won't be able to do it at all if you're not guided by a therapist.
Right.
So
An ethical therapist who's client centered and not ideologically driven is my
mhm.
my take as well. So I want to put you on the spot and you can say I don't want to, but if you could speak to J.K. Rowling, what would you say to her right now?
I'd say I'm one of your very disappointed fans, and there are many of them, and she knows this. There are a lot of people who have written about their experiences on blogs as kids, trans kids growing up, finding validation in the world of Harry Potter, and now J.K. Rowling is against them. She's
So what would
absolutely
you say
refusing
to
to.
her?
I'd say it's a real shame that you refuse to listen to us, and you'll be losing a lot of the next generation of readers by taking these anti-trans stances.
And what if
Um,
she would say, I'm hallucinating now, but what if she says, I have been listening, what am I missing? What would you say?
she's not going to say that. She's very set in her ways on this,
How do you
and
know?
I because I've read her, and I
You read
followed her on
what?
her tweets, her articles on this, her commentary on this subject. She just keeps doubling down on it. She's a billionaire, and frankly, billionaires have no business complaining about being canceled ever. So, she's kind of ridiculous at this point.
So you've given up hope for her?
Well, she could possibly still change, but I cannot imagine her at this point saying, what am I missing in good faith? I just don't believe she would.
Okay. Well, Okay, so it's interesting that you're a Harry Potter fan growing up in what you were growing up in because you obviously read it after you exited.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm a bit old for your typical Harry Potter fan, but I am a geek, right? And
So let's
also,
talk cancel culture because you just
okay.
mentioned it in regards to her, and I know you
Mhm.
wrote a thing about the right wing has always done cancel culture from your.
Yeah, or in fact, they don't do it to their own people. I mean, so we have all these complaints about cancel culture coming from the right, and I think that for the most part, they're very bad faith complaints. You know, these are people who are wealthy and powerful, who are simply worried about people criticizing them and calling it cancel culture when it's not that at all. I mean, Mark Regnerus, who wrote this study that was had very bad methodology and was used to fight against same-sex marriage in the courts. And he writes, very twisted stuff for the radical Catholic fascist site First Things all the time. And he also wrote recently for Christianity Today. The man is still a very, comfortable tenured professor in charge of a research center at UT Austin. He hasn't been canceled.
Mhm.
John Yoo, author of the Torture Memos, has shown up in the news again. I mean, but he's been at Berkeley this entire time. Where's the cancel culture?
Mhm.
And now he shows up again giving policy advice to the Trump regime. We don't cancel people for on the right wing for war crimes, for torture, for being anti-gay. They just don't want to be criticized,
Mhm.
which is a normal part of public discourse. So you look at that whole Harper's letter, and they're complaining about a supposed lack of free speech. Um, they're the counter speech that they say that they want to accept is exactly what they're railing against and calling cancel culture. It's extremely hypocritical.
Mhm. Mhm. So my take, and again, I'm biased because my background is as a cult mind control expert. When somebody leaves the Jehovah's Witnesses publicly, they get disfellowshipped, which means their family can't talk to them, their friends, they can lose their livelihood, and they're canceled until they come begging back to the elders and get
Mm-hmm.
reinstated. And the whole mindset of canceling anybody, even the people that are saying terrible things about me, I don't want to cancel them. I want to criticize them or say that you're
Mm-hmm.
saying things that aren't true about me.
But
But
who's canceling the billionaires and the millionaires who signed this letter? The very prominent writers who still get access to prominent platforms that I never get access to,
hmm,
or haven't so far in my life anyway. Maybe I will someday,
hope
But
so.
thanks. Um, who's canceling them? But I do understand the concern because I think when something like a dynamic that in kind of today's slang we're calling cancel culture, and that you've just linked to disfellowshipping, or we could link it to shunning,
Yeah,
and then we
exactly.
sometimes see it
Shunning.
in certain, and sometimes we see it in survivors communities, and I have experienced this myself, where a large part of what had been the evangelical Twitter community got on board with a smear campaign against me, in which I felt compelled to come out as a trans woman earlier than I was ready to do that publicly, just
Oh,
sort of try to make the bleeding stop. So yeah, these are real dynamics that happen, and I do worry very much when they are applied to people who aren't powerful. But when a bunch of Harry Potter fans or former fans tell J.K. Rowling that they're mad at her now, she's not canceled. She's an extremely wealthy woman with access to very prestigious platforms.
I see. So the fact if somebody has money and power, then they can't be canceled, even if people are saying, let's, burn the books and never.
Well, there's a nuance here where and I don't think anyone's saying burn your Harry Potter books. I mean, I haven't seen, probably someone has said it on Twitter, possibly a Russian troll, but
Russian
I,
trolls, active measures. That's a whole nother. We're gonna have to do another one and talk about Russia more. But
I,
keep
uh,
keep
I,
going.
cer- I certainly haven't seen it. So, book burning is generally not something that I'm for, but I'm also not for Mein Kampf being prominently displayed in every bookstore, or, being readily pushed on people.
Right.
There's a difference between deplatforming and canceling, but people like J.K. Rowling are not even deplatformed. I mean, think about when, a few years ago, I think it was, maybe a couple of years ago, there was a big hubbub about Steve Bannon being invited to participate in some kind of event. I don't remember the details exactly, but I think it was hosted by the New Yorker.
Mm.
Does Steve Bannon need to have, do we gain anything, an ability to listen to Steve Bannon that we don't otherwise have by treating him as a respectable person who deserves to be invited to this sort of, I don't think we do. And
Right.
so I don't think we need to give Steve Bannon access to every platform, you know, and I think that
Even though
when we
the
do it,
Mercers put him on the Trump campaign and got him
right.
elected.
But we all know this, and he spouts off all the time, so we can read what Steve Bannon thinks. We don't need to invite him to respectable places because he should be considered outside the Overton window. It's very
Yeah.
dangerous that he is not.
Yeah. I
So
hear you. No, I think it's a very tricky world we live in when it comes to disinformation and active measures by state actors that are wanting to destroy American democracy and impose authoritarianism. I have to admit I was happy Alex Jones got deplatformed because I
yeah, see,
think
this
he's
is a good
doing a lot of
example.
harm.
Sure, when you're spreading demonstrably false information, why should you be given access to platforms that have every legal right not to let you air your views via their platform?
Yeah, especially if you're calling for violence and
Right, which is already a restriction on free speech that we have recognized in the law, right? Because there cannot be absolute free speech of every kind. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater,
yeah.
when there's not a fire. So all these things are somewhat tricky to navigate, but you deplatform someone like Alex Jones from Twitter. You don't invite Steve Bannon to prominent conversations with serious intellectuals. You're not limiting their free speech.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's uh, it's a troubled times, and I just keep coming back to my orientation, which is the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that I'm for free speech, even if it hurts. You
Hmm.
know,
And I am too, but I'm just not for platforming everyone everywhere. I don't think the New York Times should have published that Tom Cotton op-ed that they
Mhm.
published. Right? That's under their editorial control. They don't have to. They don't have to do it. He
Yeah,
still has.
that's a little grayer area for me, and I honestly, my life choices is to look at Fox and Wall Street Journal and want to get a wider view, and I am a New York Times subscriber,
Oh, and I'm still a
so
subscriber as well. I'm not one of these
it
people who
doesn't
canceled
bother
them.
me that much, especially
Hmm.
because there was so much response to it that was critical of what he was saying.
Hmm.
So I
Sure, but you're
guess
concerned about trolls and disinformation, and I mean, one of the things that we've
I
been
am.
learning, and one of the things that we've been learning in this year, in these times, is that counter speech. Well, what we've been learning through looking at how trolls use social media, and also simply doing more, cognitive psychology and neuroscience and that sort of thing, is that the answer to free speech being more speech is sort of a naive view at this
Yeah.
point. That once you have a bunch of competing views out there about very important political initiatives of our time, a lot of people will decide that they just can't decide, and then they'll just tune everything out, or they'll just listen to the sources that appeal most to them, and then they'll go from Fox News to the most, which is already conspiratorial and often false enough, into the really wild world of YouTube conspiracy
I
theories and
agree.
QAnon, and so I think something like the fairness doctrine is actually a good thing to make sure that TV is not spreading disinformation, because
That
it does
got
have
repealed by Reagan, I think, right?
yeah, yeah. And it does have consequences when you put the existence of Fox News has directly contributed, I believe, to America's descent into fascism. And so I'm not saying never watch Fox News because it exists. We should know what they're saying there. And this is
I
why I'm glad
agree.
that we have Media Matters and that sort of thing. But
Yep.
I don't think it's a good thing that a news organization that's supposed to be dedicated to reporting can be entirely editorializing and not even responsibly. I
Yes.
mean, they make things up sometimes.
No, I think that's
They're not
great.
as bad as RT, but they're moving in that direction.
Yeah, and in the cult of Trump, I talked about how Alex Jones took 1,000 stories from RT, Russian Putin propaganda, and that got picked up by Breitbart, that got picked up by Fox, and then it got picked
Hmm.
up by a lot of mainstream media who were outraged at it, but nevertheless were continuing to message it, which
Yeah,
is
very
crazy.
strange.
Very
Hmm.
bad. Any last
So
things
yeah.
as we wrap up, Chrissy? Thank you so much. I always learn when I'm talking with you, and
Well, same.
I
Thank you
really,
so much for having me back on, Steve. I really appreciate you too, and what you do here. And I'm glad to be a part of these kinds of conversations. And I'm I'm someone that has come from a place of of serious trauma, but I've gotten some therapy. I've worked through a lot of things. I just turned 40, so I think I'm in a position where I can sometimes have these more sort of difficult conversations and disagree with people and not want to cancel everybody. I guess I'll just say this, when these dynamics are applied to people that lack power, that's a case where I think so-called cancel culture is a serious issue, right? Don't get the guy who works for McDonald's fired, but also don't really worry about J.K. Rowling. She's fine.
right. So that's you really taught me that a very important lesson about that, about power dynamics and such. And I admit that my approach to it has been kind of ideological in the sense of criticize the ideas but not the people, or like
Sure, and you've made me think
try to
through.
listen to them, because and maybe you can change their mind. That's what I'm in the business
Mm,
of, helping people reevaluate whatever their ideological totalist positions are. And it's
sure.
not from a point of view of I'm going to persuade you that you're wrong. It's more like, let me tell you what I learned about social psychology and
Hmm.
neuroscience, and let me tell you stories of other groups that you would agree are bad, and then tell me how your group is different than that, and just to make people think about.
Yeah, and you certainly do that for me, and you force me to confront and think through some of my own biases, and I do appreciate that.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm glad we got to meet when I was out in Portland. I think we
Me
even
too.
snapped a
That was so
picture.
nice.
And let's stay in touch. And I think I'd like to do another one on Russia, because you're an expert on Russia.
All
So
right,
we'll be in
sure.
touch.
Okay,
Thank.
take care.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.